The Japanese petty officer's eyes widened in disbelief as the American Navy surgeon carefully stitched his shattered leg back together. Blood had pooled beneath him on the medical table, and Hiroshi Sakamoto was certain this was some cruel torture before his inevitable execution. Instead, Lieutenant Charles Whitman worked with the precision of a master craftsman, his steady hands moving methodically to save the limb that enemy shrapnel had nearly destroyed. When Sakamoto whispered through gritted teeth, "Why save the enemy?" the American doctor paused, looked directly into his eyes, and replied with words that would echo through decades, "Because you're human." This wasn't the war either man had expected to fight, and what happened next would challenge everything they believed about honor, duty, and the enemy across the battlefield. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of December 15, 1943, began like any other aboard the Japanese destroyer Yamakaze, as it cut through the choppy waters near the Marshall Islands. Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Sakamoto stood at his battle station, watching the horizon through salt-stained binoculars while the Pacific wind whipped across the deck. At 24 years old, he had already survived 18 months of brutal naval combat, his weathered hands bearing the scars of countless engagements against the American fleet. The rising sun painted the ocean in shades of crimson and gold, a sight that reminded him of the silk banner hanging in his family's modest home in Nagoya, where his elderly parents waited for news of their only son. Sakamoto adjusted his grip on the binoculars and swept his gaze across the seemingly empty seascape, unaware that 3 American destroyers were closing in from the north, their radar systems having detected the Bakras. Yamakaze during the pre-dawn hours. The young petty officer had grown up listening to stories of samurai honor from his grandfather, tales of warriors who chose death before dishonor, who viewed capture as the ultimate shame. These stories had shaped his understanding of duty and sacrifice, instilling in him the belief that a true Japanese sailor would never surrender, would never allow himself to be taken alive by the enemy. Yet as he stood there in the morning light, scanning for threats that were already much closer than he imagined, Sakamoto could not have foreseen how profoundly his convictions would be tested in the hours ahead. The first explosion shattered the morning calm, with a thunderous roar that seemed to split the very air itself. American shells screamed overhead before crashing into the Yamakaze's superstructure, sending twisted metal and burning debris cascading across the deck. Sakamoto felt the destroyer lurch violently to starboard as he was thrown against the steel railing, his binoculars spinning away into the churning sea below. Through the acrid smoke and deafening noise of battle, he could hear the desperate shouts of his shipmates as they scrambled to their action stations. But the American attack had caught them completely off guard, and the Yamakaze's return fire was sporadic and ineffective. Within minutes, it became clear that the destroyer was mortally wounded. Secondary explosions rocked the ship as fuel lines ruptured and ammunition stores detonated, creating a hellish inferno that consumed everything in its path. Sakamoto dragged himself to his feet, his uniform torn and bloodied, and began helping wounded sailors toward the lifeboats, though he knew in his heart that most of them would never make it off the ship alive. The deck beneath his feet tilted at an increasingly steep angle as seawater poured through massive holes in the hull, and he could feel the Yamakaze beginning her final descent toward the ocean floor. The last thing Sakamoto remembered clearly was the searing pain that tore through his left leg as a piece of shrapnel, hot as molten steel, sliced through muscle and bone just above his knee. He looked down in shock to see his own blood spreading across the tilting deck, the wound so severe that white bone was visible through the mangled flesh. As the destroyer continued its death throes around him, rolling further onto its side with each passing second, Sakamoto felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. This was how a Japanese sailor should die, he thought, fighting to the end rather than facing the shame of capture. He closed his eyes and prepared to go down with his ship, accepting what seemed like an honorable death. But fate had other plans for Petty Officer Sakamoto. Strong hands grabbed him under the arms and hauled him toward one of the few remaining lifeboats, though he was barely conscious and couldn't identify his rescuer through the haze of pain and smoke. The next several hours passed in a blur of agony as he drifted in and out of consciousness. floating in the lifeboat among the debris-scattered waters while his leg continued to bleed, despite the makeshift tourniquet someone had fashioned from torn cloth. He awoke at intervals to find himself sharing the small boat with 3 other survivors, all of them badly wounded, all of them facing the grim prospect of slow death under the merciless Pacific sun. It was nearly sunset when the American destroyer escort pulled alongside their lifeboat, and Sakamoto's first coherent thought was that his suffering would soon end. He had heard the stories, whispered among Japanese forces throughout the Pacific, about how American forces showed no mercy to captured enemies. The propaganda broadcasts had painted vivid pictures of torture and execution, describing Americans as barbaric demons who delighted in the suffering of their prisoners. As rough hands lifted him from the lifeboat and carried him aboard the American vessel, Sakamoto steeled himself for whatever brutalities awaited him, determined to die with dignity, even if he could not die in battle. Instead, he found himself in what appeared to be a medical bay, lying on a clean white table under bright lights, while uniformed Americans moved efficiently around him. Through his pain-clouded vision, he could make out medical instruments laid out with surgical precision, bottles of medicine lined up on shelves, and the antiseptic smell that he associated with hospitals back home in Japan. None of this matched his expectations of American brutality, and for a moment he wondered if this was some elaborate psychological torture designed to break his spirit before the real suffering began. Lieutenant Charles Whitman had been serving as the ship's surgeon for 8 months when the young Akashi survivors were brought aboard, and he had already treated dozens of wounded American sailors during his deployment to the Pacific Theater. At 32 years old, the soft-spoken doctor from Minnesota had volunteered for naval service despite having a thriving medical practice back home. Driven by a sense of duty that his own father, a World War I veteran, had instilled in him from childhood, Whitman believed deeply in the Hippocratic oath he had taken upon becoming a physician. The solemn promise to, first, do no harm that transcended nationality, race, or the circumstances of war. When Whitman first examined Sakamoto's shattered leg, he was struck by how young the Japanese sailor appeared, hardly more than a boy despite his military bearing and the steely resolve in his dark eyes. The wound was severe, with significant damage to both the femur and the surrounding soft tissue, but it was not beyond repair if treated promptly and properly. As he prepared his instruments and called for assistance, Whitman was acutely aware of the hostile stares from some of his own crew members. Sailors who had lost friends to Japanese attacks and saw no reason to waste medical supplies on enemy prisoners. "Doc, why are you bothering with that one?" asked Seaman Rodriguez, one of Whitman's regular assistants, as he watched the surgeon examine Sakamoto's wounds. "He's just going to end up in a prison camp anyway, and we need those supplies for our own boys." The sentiment was echoed by murmurs from other crew members who had gathered to watch, their faces hard with the accumulated anger and grief of months of brutal warfare. Rodriguez had lost his best friend during a kamikaze attack just 2 weeks earlier, and the sight of a Japanese prisoner receiving medical care while his buddy lay buried at sea filled him with bitter resentment. Whitman looked up from his examination, his blue eyes steady and uncompromising, despite the pressure he felt from his own men. "This sailor is badly wounded, and in my care," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of both his rank and his medical training. "I took an oath to preserve life, not to judge who deserves treatment based on the uniform they wear." He returned his attention to Sakamoto's leg, beginning the delicate process of cleaning and examining the wound, while the injured Japanese sailor watched him with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. The American doctor's gentle touch and obvious skill were so far removed from what Sakamoto had expected that he began to wonder if he was hallucinating from blood loss. As Whitman worked to stabilize the fracture and control the bleeding, he noticed that his patient was fully conscious and observing every move he made. The young Japanese sailor's eyes held a fierce intelligence along with the expected wariness of a captured enemy. But there was something else there too, a quality that reminded Whitman of the young medical students he had once taught back in civilian life. Despite the language barrier and the circumstances that had brought them together, the doctor found himself speaking quietly to Sakamoto as he worked, explaining each step of the treatment in the same calm, reassuring tone he had always used with his patients back home. "I'm going to give you something for the pain now," Whitman said as he prepared a morphine injection, knowing that Sakamoto likely couldn't understand his words, but hoping that his tone would convey his peaceful intentions. "This is going to help you feel better." He administered the injection with practiced efficiency, and almost immediately saw some of the tension leave the Japanese sailor's face as the powerful painkiller began to take effect. For the first time since being brought aboard, Sakamoto's rigid military posture relaxed slightly, though his eyes never left the American doctor's face. The surgery to repair Sakamoto's leg took nearly 3 hours, during which Whitman demonstrated the same level of care and precision that he would have shown to any patient, enemy, or ally. He carefully realigned the fractured bone, removed fragments of metal shrapnel that had been driven deep into the muscle tissue, and meticulously sutured the damaged blood vessels to ensure proper healing. Throughout the procedure, he was assisted by Petty Officer Jenkins, a young corpsman who had initially questioned the wisdom of treating enemy prisoners, but gradually became absorbed in the delicate medical work unfolding before him. "Will he be able to walk normally again, sir?" Jenkins asked as he watched Whitman put the finishing touches on his sutures, the quality of the surgeon's work evident in the neat, precise stitches that would minimize scarring and maximize function. The corpsman had grown up on a farm in Iowa and had seen his share of injuries to both animals and people, but he had never witnessed such skillful surgical repair work. Despite his initial reservations about treating a Japanese prisoner, he found himself genuinely curious about the young sailor's prospects for recovery. "With proper rehabilitation, yes," Whitman replied, as he began wrapping the leg in clean bandages. "The bone will heal strong, and I was able to save all the major muscle groups. He's young and appears to be in excellent physical condition, which will work in his favor during recovery." As he spoke, he glanced at Sakamoto's face and was surprised to see that the Japanese sailor appeared to be following their conversation despite the language barrier, his eyes moving intelligently between the two Americans as they discussed his prognosis. When the surgery was complete and Sakamoto had been moved to a recovery area, Whitman sat beside the wounded prisoner's bed to check his vital signs and ensure that there were no immediate complications from the procedure. It was during this quiet moment, with most of the ship's crew occupied with other duties, that Sakamoto spoke for the first time since being brought aboard. His voice was weak from the anesthesia and blood loss, but his words were clear despite his limited English vocabulary. "Why save enemy?" Sakamoto asked, his dark eyes searching Whitman's face for some explanation that would make sense of this bewildering turn of events. He had been prepared for torture, interrogation, or summary execution, any of which would have fit with his understanding of how wars were supposed to be fought. Instead, he found himself the recipient of medical care that was probably superior to what he would have received in a Japanese military hospital, provided by a man whose countrymen he had been trying to kill just hours earlier. Whitman considered his answer carefully, aware that his words might be the first positive contact this young man had ever had with an American, and possibly the foundation for changing his understanding of who the enemy truly was. He looked into Sakamoto's eyes and saw not a faceless enemy combatant, but a frightened young man far from home, wounded and confused by the kindness he was receiving from those he had been taught to hate. The doctor's response came from the depths of his medical training and his fundamental beliefs about the value of human life. "Because you're human," Whitman said simply, his words carrying a weight and sincerity that transcended the language barrier between them. He reached out and gently adjusted Sakamoto's pillow, a gesture of care that was as natural to him as breathing, but which struck the Japanese sailor like a physical blow. In those 3 words, and that simple act of kindness, Sakamoto heard something that challenged everything he had been taught about the American enemy, something that planted a seed of doubt about the nature of the war he had been fighting. The days that followed were a blur of recovery and quiet observation for Sakamoto, who found himself in the strange position of being cared for by men he had been trained to view as demons. The ship's medical bay became his world, a small space where the usual rules of war seemed suspended in favor of something more fundamental and human. Whitman checked on him regularly, monitoring his progress and adjusting his treatment as needed, while Corporal Jenkins brought him meals and helped him with the basic tasks that his injured leg made difficult. What struck Sakamoto most profoundly during his recovery was the matter-of-fact kindness with which he was treated by most of the American medical staff. There were no dramatic gestures of friendship or attempts to convert him to their way of thinking. Just the steady, professional care that these men would have provided to anyone in their charge. Jenkins, in particular, seemed genuinely interested in his well-being, asking about his pain levels and ensuring that he was comfortable, despite the fact that they could barely communicate beyond basic gestures and a BS. Few shared words. As his strength returned and the pain in his legs subsided, Sakamoto began to observe the daily routines of the American sailors around him. He watched them go about their duties with the same dedication and professionalism he had seen in his own Navy. Listened to them joke and complain about their officers in ways that reminded him of conversations he had shared with his own shipmates. They wrote letters to families back home, worried about friends in other units, and dealt with the same fears and uncertainties that plagued every fighting man in wartime. Slowly, reluctantly, he began to recognize that these Americans were not so different from the Japanese sailors he had served alongside. One morning, nearly a week after his surgery, Sakamoto was surprised to receive a visitor who was not part of the medical staff. Commander Harrison, the ship's executive officer, appeared beside his bed carrying a small stack of books and what appeared to be writing materials. The commander was a tall, lean man with graying hair and tired eyes that spoke of months of combat command, and Sakamoto tensed instinctively as he approached, unsure what to expect from this meeting with a senior American Buree. "Officer, Dr. Whitman tells me you're recovering well," Commander Harrison said in careful, slow English, settling into a chair beside the bed. "I thought you might like something to read, and perhaps paper to write letters home." He placed the books and writing materials on the bedside table, gesturing toward them with a slight smile. "The books are simple English stories, nothing military. The doctor thought they might help you improve your language skills while you recover." Sakamoto stared at the gifts in amazement, unable to comprehend why an American commander would show such consideration for a prisoner of war. The books appeared to be popular novels, their covers bright and cheerful, completely unlike the military manuals and propaganda texts that had made up most of his reading material during the war. The writing paper was of good quality, clearly not the bare minimum that might be expected for a prisoner, and there were several pencils included along with what appeared to be stamps for mailing letters. "Why give this?" Sakamoto asked, his English halting but improving after days of listening to the American crew members around him. He gestured toward the books and paper with genuine confusion, his understanding of warfare and prisoner treatment once again challenged by unexpected kindness. "I am enemy prisoner. You should not help." Commander Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful as he considered how to explain something that was fundamental to his own worldview but clearly foreign to this young Japanese sailor. "You're a wounded man recovering from surgery," he said finally. "The war is still going on out there, but in this medical bay, you're just another patient who needs care and something to occupy his time while he heals. Dr. Whitman asked me to find you some books, and I figured you might want to write to your family so they know you're alive." The concept of communicating with his family while in enemy hands was so unexpected that Sakamoto initially assumed he had misunderstood the commander's broken explanation. In his understanding of warfare, prisoners simply disappeared until the conflict ended. Their families left to wonder whether they were alive or dead. The possibility that his parents might receive word of his survival through American postal services seemed too remarkable to believe. Yet the writing materials sitting beside his bed were tangible proof of the offer's sincerity. Over the following days, Sakamoto found himself spending hours with the English novels, slowly working through simple sentences with the help of a worn English-Japanese dictionary that Corporal Jenkins had somehow acquired from another crew member. The stories were unlike anything he had read before. Tales of ordinary Americans living ordinary lives, falling in love, dealing with family problems, pursuing dreams that had nothing to do with war or conquest. Through these simple narratives, he began to develop a picture of American society that bore no resemblance to the propaganda descriptions he had heard throughout his military service. The letter to his parents proved even more challenging than the Sami. Novels. Not because of the language barrier, but because of the emotional complexity of trying to explain his situation without revealing military information or bringing shame upon his family. He wrote and rewrote the letter dozens of times, finally settling on a simple message, explaining that he had been wounded in action but was recovering well, that he was being treated with kindness by his captors, and that they should not worry about his honor or his future. The act of writing those words, of committing to paper the reality that he was receiving compassion from the enemy, forced him to confront the profound changes taking place in his understanding of the war and his place in it. Dr. Whitman continued his regular visits throughout Sakamoto's recovery, monitoring the healing of his leg and gradually reducing the pain medication as the young sailor's condition improved. During these medical consultations, the two men began to engage in longer conversations, with Whitman patiently helping Sakamoto practice his English while learning a few basic Japanese phrases in return. These exchanges, initially focused on medical matters and basic needs, gradually expanded to include topics that revealed the common humanity underlying their different uniforms. "Do you have family in America?" Sakamoto asked during one of these visits, his curiosity about his doctor's background overcoming his natural reticence. He had been wondering about the personal motivations of the man who had saved his leg, trying to understand what kind of person would show such dedication to healing an enemy combatant. Wife? Children? Whitman's face softened as he considered the question, and for a moment his professional demeanor gave way to something more personal and vulnerable. "I have a wife back in Minnesota," he said quietly, pulling out a small photograph from his wallet to show Sakamoto. The picture showed a pretty blonde woman in her 30s, smiling warmly at the camera from what appeared to be a garden setting. "Her name is Margaret. We've been married for 6 years, but we haven't been able to have children yet. She's a nurse at the hospital where I used to work before the war." Sakamoto studied the photograph with genuine interest, seeing in Margaret Whitman's face the same kind of gentle strength he had observed in his own mother. "She must worry for you," he said, the words carrying more weight than his simple English could fully convey. In that moment, both men were acutely aware of the women waiting for them at home, the uncertainty and fear that military wives lived with every day, regardless of which flag their husbands served under. The universality of that experience created a bridge of understanding between them that had nothing to do with politics or national loyalty. "Every day," Whitman admitted, tucking the photograph back into his wallet. "She writes to me whenever the mail ships can get through, and I know she's terrified that one day the letters will just stop coming. I suppose your parents feel the same way about you." The parallel he drew was intentional, a gentle way of acknowledging that concern for loved ones was not limited to any single nationality, that the bonds of family transcended the artificial divisions created by war. As Sakamoto's physical condition continued to improve, he found himself grappling with increasingly complex questions about duty, honor, and the nature of his captivity. According to everything he had been taught, he should have died with his ship rather than allowing himself to be rescued, and having survived, he should now be seeking every opportunity to escape or to die fighting, rather than accepting medical treatment from the enemy. Yet the kindness he had received from Whitman, Jenkins, and even Commander Harrison made it impossible to maintain the simple hatred that military doctrine demanded. The internal conflict reached a crisis point during his 3rd week of recovery, when Sakamoto was finally strong enough to walk short distances with the aid of crutches. As he moved slowly through the ship's corridors during his physical therapy sessions, he observed the daily life of the American crew and found himself unexpectedly moved by scenes that reminded him of his own naval service. He watched young sailors writing letters home, saw officers studying navigation charts with the same intense concentration he remembered from his own bridge watch duties, and observed the careful maintenance routines that kept the ship functioning in the harsh maritime environment. One afternoon, while practicing his walking exercises on the ship's main deck, Sakamoto encountered a group of American sailors engaged in what appeared to be a memorial service for fallen comrades. The ceremony was simple and, dignified, with no elaborate ritual or propaganda speeches, just men taking a moment to honor friends who had died in recent battles. As he watched from a respectful distance, Sakamoto was struck by the genuine grief in their faces, the same expression of loss he had seen among his own shipmates after combat engagements. The realization that these Americans mourned their dead with the same sincerity and depth as Japanese sailors created another crack in the ideological wall he had built around his understanding of the enemy. That evening, as Dr. Whitman made his routine check of Sakamoto's progress, the young Japanese sailor finally voiced the questions that had been troubling him for weeks. "Doctor," he began hesitantly, "in Japan, we learned that Americans are evil, that you have no honor, no respect for family or duty. But here, I see men who write letters to wives, who cry for dead friends, who work hard for their ship. I do not understand this difference between what I was taught and what I see." Whitman set down his medical instruments and took a seat beside Sakamoto's bed, recognizing that this conversation went far beyond medical treatment and into territory that would require careful navigation. "What did they tell you about why Americans fight?" he asked gently, genuine curiosity in his voice. "What reasons did they give for our actions in this war?" Sakamoto struggled to find the English words to convey concepts that had been drilled into him since childhood. Propaganda ideas that now seemed increasingly hollow when measured against his direct experience. "They say Americans want to destroy Japan, to enslave our people, to steal our land and honor. They say you are demons, who delight in causing suffering, who have no understanding of duty or sacrifice." Even as he spoke the words, he could hear how unconvincing they sounded in the context of the medical bay where he had been treated with such consistent kindness. "And what do you think now?" Whitman asked, his question carrying no judgment or pressure, merely an invitation for Sakamoto to examine his own changing perceptions. "Based on what you've observed during your time here, do those descriptions match what you've experienced?" The question forced Sakamoto to confront the fundamental contradiction between his military training and his lived experience as a prisoner of war. Everything he had seen and experienced aboard the American ship contradicted the propaganda narratives that had shaped his understanding of the enemy. Yet accepting this truth meant questioning everything he had believed about the righteousness of Japan's cause and his own role in the conflict. The internal struggle was visible in his expression as he wrestled with concepts that challenged the very foundation of his worldview. "I think," Sakamoto said slowly, choosing his words with great care, "that men on both sides have been told stories about the enemy that may not be true. I think that you, Dr. Whitman, are a good man who heals people, because that is what good men do. Not because of your country or your flag. I think that I have been taught to hate people I do not really know, and that maybe those people have been taught the same thing about me." It was a profound admission, one that represented a complete transformation in Sakamoto's understanding of the war and his place in it. Whitman recognized the courage it had taken for the young sailor to voice such thoughts, knowing that they constituted a form of intellectual and emotional rebellion against everything he had been raised to believe. The American doctor felt a deep respect for Sakamoto's willingness to examine his own preconceptions and to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about the nature of propaganda and indoctrination. "I think you're right," Whitman said simply, his words carrying the weight of his own evolving understanding of the conflict and the men caught up in it. "I've treated wounded soldiers from both sides, and I've found that they all bleed the same color, they all worry about the same things, and they all want to go home to their families when the fighting is over. The uniforms may be different, but the humanity underneath is exactly the same." As Sakamoto's time aboard the American ship drew to a close, with arrangements being made for his transfer to a prisoner of war facility in Australia, both he and Dr. Whitman were acutely aware that their unusual relationship was about to end. The young Japanese sailor had recovered remarkably well from his injuries, his leg healing stronger than even Whitman had initially hoped. But the bonds formed during his convalescence had created connections that transcended the temporary nature of his medical treatment. On his final morning aboard the ship, Sakamoto sought out Dr. Whitman to express his gratitude in a way that his limited English could not fully convey. He had spent hours preparing what he wanted to say, consulting his dictionary and carefully rehearsing the words that would carry the full weight of his transformed understanding. When he found Whitman in the medical bay, preparing supplies for the day's routine duties. The young sailor approached with the formal bearing that had characterized his military service, but his expression carried a warmth and respect that spoke of profound personal change. "Dr. Whitman," Sakamoto began, standing as straight as his healing leg would allow, "I want to thank you for saving my life, but more than that, I want to thank you for teaching me something important about what it means to be human. Before I came to your ship, I thought I understood honor and duty. But I learned them only in terms of hatred and violence. You showed me that true honor comes from helping others, even when they are supposed to be your enemies." End quote. Whitman was moved by the sincerity and thoughtfulness of Sakamoto's words, recognizing that the young man was expressing something far more significant than simple gratitude for medical treatment. "You don't need to thank me for doing my job," he replied, though his voice carried genuine warmth and affection. "But I want you to know that knowing you has been important for me too. You've reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place, and why that commitment to healing has to be stronger than any political differences or military orders." Before parting, Whitman presented Sakamoto with a small gift, a pocket-sized English dictionary that he had annotated with medical terms and common phrases that might prove useful during his imprisonment. Inside the front cover, he had written a simple inscription, "To Hiroshi Sakamoto, a good man who taught me about courage and honor. Charles Whitman, November 1943." The gesture was both practical and symbolic, representing the doctor's hope that Sakamoto would continue learning and growing during the difficult years ahead. Sakamoto accepted the dictionary with deep emotion, understanding that it represented far more than a language-learning tool. It was a tangible connection to the experience that had fundamentally changed his understanding of himself and the world around him, a reminder of the moment when an enemy had chosen to see him as a human being rather than a target for hatred. In return, he offered Whitman a small wooden carving that he had worked on during his recovery, using a knife borrowed from Corman Jenkins and wood scraps found around the ship. The carving depicted a crane in flight, a symbol of longevity and good fortune in Japanese culture, and he had inscribed it with his name and the date of his rescue. The transfer to the prisoner of war camp in Australia marked the beginning of a new chapter in Sakamoto's wartime experience, but the lessons he had learned aboard the American ship continued to shape his perspective. Throughout his imprisonment, the camp conditions were harsh but fair, with adequate food and medical care provided according to international conventions. And Sakamoto found himself serving as an informal interpreter and cultural bridge between the Japanese prisoners and their Australian guards. His English skills, developed through his conversations with Dr. Whitman and his study of the novels provided by Commander Harrison, made him valuable as a communicator and mediator in situations where misunderstandings might otherwise lead to conflict. More importantly, Sakamoto's transformed understanding of the enemy allowed him to help his fellow prisoners navigate the psychological challenges of captivity with greater resilience and dignity. He shared his experiences aboard the American ship carefully and selectively, recognizing that many of his compatriots were not ready to hear about enemy kindness. But he worked quietly to counteract the more extreme forms of hatred and despair that could consume men facing indefinite imprisonment. His message was subtle but consistent. The guards and administrators were human beings doing a difficult job, not demons bent on causing unnecessary suffering. During the long months of imprisonment, Sakamoto maintained a correspondence with Dr. Whitman, their letters routed through the International Red Cross and subject to censorship by military authorities on both sides. These exchanges, necessarily limited in their discussion of military matters, became a lifeline for both men as the war dragged on through 1944 and into 1945. Whitman shared news of his continued service in the Pacific, his growing medical experience, and his hopes for returning to his practice and his wife when peace finally came. Sakamoto wrote about his life in the prison camp, his efforts to help fellow prisoners, and his evolving thoughts about the future of Japan and his place in it. The letters also revealed the personal growth that both men experienced as a result of their encounter. Whitman found that his treatment of Sakamoto had clarified his own values and strengthened his commitment to medicine as a healing art rather than merely a technical skill. He began to see his wartime service not just as a patriotic duty, but as an opportunity to demonstrate the principles of compassion and human dignity that transcended national boundaries. His letters spoke of treating wounded Japanese prisoners with the same care he provided to American casualties, and of the quiet satisfaction he felt when enemy soldiers recovered fully from their injuries. Sakamoto's correspondence revealed an even more dramatic transformation. As the young man who had once been willing to die for the emperor began to envision a post-war Japan that could learn from its defeats and build a more peaceful relationship with the world. His letters spoke of his desire to become a teacher when the war ended, to help young Japanese understand that strength came not from dominating others, but from building bridges of understanding and cooperation. He credited his time aboard Whitman's ship with opening his eyes to possibilities he had never imagined during his military indoctrination. The end of the war in August 1945 brought both relief and uncertainty to prisoners on both sides of the Pacific conflict. For Sakamoto, the surrender of Japan meant freedom from the prison camp, but it also meant returning to a homeland that had been devastated by bombing and invasion, where traditional values and institutions had been shattered, along with cities and factories. The journey home aboard an American transport ship provided him with another opportunity to observe American servicemen, this time in their moment of victory. And he was struck by their general absence of vindictiveness toward their former enemies. The reunion with his parents in Nagoya was emotionally overwhelming, as Sakamoto had to explain not only his survival and imprisonment, but also the profound changes in his worldview that had occurred during his captivity. His father, a traditional man who had served in the Japanese army during the earlier war with Russia, initially struggled to understand how his son could speak positively about American kindness and medical care. His mother, more pragmatic and focused on the fact that her only child had survived when so many others had not, was simply grateful for whatever forces had brought him safely home. Sakamoto's reintegration into Japanese society was complicated by his transformed perspective on the war and its aftermath. While many of his countrymen struggled with shame and bitterness over their defeat, he found himself uniquely positioned to appreciate the opportunities that surrender had created for Japanese renewal and reconstruction. His experience with American medical care had given him insight into Western approaches to healing and human welfare, and he began to see the American occupation not as a humiliation to be endured, but as a chance to learn from former enemies who had demonstrated their capacity for both strength and mercy. True to the aspirations expressed in his wartime letters, Sakamoto pursued a career in education, eventually becoming a teacher of English and international relations at a Tokyo high school. His classroom became a place where young Japanese could learn not just language skills, but also broader lessons about the importance of understanding other cultures and questioning the propaganda narratives that, quote, governments use to justify conflict. He never spoke directly about his wartime experiences in class, but his teaching was infused with the insights he had gained from his encounter with Dr. Whitman and his subsequent imprisonment. The relationship between Sakamoto and Whitman continued long after the war ended, evolving from the wartime correspondence into a deep personal friendship that spanned decades and continents. Whitman returned to his medical practice in Minnesota, where he specialized in trauma surgery and became known for his exceptional skill in treating complex injuries. His experience treating war wounds had made him one of the most capable surgeons in the Midwest, but those who worked with him noticed something else in his approach to patient care: a gentleness and cultural sensitivity that seemed to come from some deeper understanding of human suffering and resilience. In 1952, 7 years after the war's end, Whitman made his first trip to Japan as part of a medical exchange program designed to share surgical techniques and rebuild the Japanese healthcare system. The reunion with Sakamoto in Tokyo was emotionally powerful for both men, representing not just the renewal of a personal friendship, but also the possibility of healing between former enemies. Whitman spent 2 weeks in Japan, dividing his time between medical conferences and personal visits with Sakamoto and his family, and he was deeply moved by the warmth with which he was received by people who had once been taught to view Americans as demons. The visit also allowed Whitman to see firsthand the results of his wartime decision to treat an enemy soldier with compassion and professional care. Sakamoto had become not just a successful educator, but a bridge between cultures, helping to foster understanding between Japan and America during the crucial early years of the post-war relationship. His students, many of whom would go on to become business leaders, diplomats, and educators themselves, carried forward the lessons of tolerance and mutual respect that had their origins in a ship's medical bay during the darkest days of the Pacific War. During Whitman's visit, Sakamoto arranged for him to speak to several groups of students and community leaders about his experiences as a military doctor and his approach to treating patients regardless of rank, nationality, or political affiliation. These presentations, delivered through Sakamoto's skilled interpretation, provided Japanese audiences with insights into American values and medical practices that helped dispel lingering stereotypes and misconceptions from the war years. Whitman's gentle manner and obvious respect for Japanese culture made a powerful impression on his listeners, many of whom were encountering their first positive American role model since the occupation began. The friendship between the two men deepened during this visit and the subsequent exchanges that followed over the years. Whitman returned to Japan several more times during the 1950s and 60s, sometimes for medical conferences and sometimes simply as a tourist, eager to explore the country and culture that had produced his basha. Remarkable friend. Sakamoto, meanwhile, was able to visit the United States on several occasions, staying with the Whitman family in Minnesota and marveling at the suburban prosperity and cultural diversity that characterized post-war America. These visits gave both men opportunities to observe how their respective countries were evolving in the decades following the war, and they often discussed the ways in which their personal relationship reflected broader possibilities for international understanding and cooperation. Whitman was particularly struck by Japan's rapid economic recovery and its emergence as a peaceful, democratic nation, while Sakamoto was impressed by America's capacity for self-criticism and social change, qualities that he observed during the Civil Rights Movement and the debates over American involvement in Vietnam. The correspondence between the two men became a remarkable historical record of the personal dimensions of post-war reconciliation, touching on subjects ranging from medical advances and educational philosophy to family developments and cultural observations. Whitman wrote about his growing surgical practice, his involvement in training young doctors, and his continuing commitment to treating all patients with equal care and dignity. He also shared news of his family life, including the eventual arrival of 2 adopted children who brought joy and purpose to his marriage with Margaret. Sakamoto's letters provided insights into Japan's transformation from a militaristic society to a peaceful democracy, but they also revealed the personal costs of that transition for individuals who had lived through both eras. He wrote about the challenges of helping his students understand their country's wartime behavior without falling into either excessive guilt or defensive nationalism, about the difficulties faced by veterans attempting to find meaning in their post-war lives, and about his own ongoing efforts to reconcile his military past with his civilian future. One particularly poignant exchange occurred in 1967, when Sakamoto wrote to inform Whitman of his father's death and the complex emotions that the loss had generated. The elder Sakamoto had never fully understood his son's transformed worldview, continuing to view the war in traditional terms of honor and shame until his final days. But he had gradually come to respect his son's achievements as an educator and his contributions to Japanese-American friendship. In his final months, weakened by illness, the old soldier had asked to hear stories about the American doctor who had saved his son's life, and Sakamoto had found himself serving as a bridge between his father's traditional values and his own evolved understanding of honor and duty. Whitman's response to news of the death was characteristic of the empathy and cultural sensitivity that had defined their relationship from the beginning. He wrote about his own father's death several years earlier, sharing his understanding of the complex grief that comes from losing a parent with whom one has fundamental disagreements. And he offered insights into the ways in which honoring a parent's memory could coexist with pursuing a different path in life. His letter provided comfort to Sakamoto during a difficult period and reinforced the emotional bonds that had sustained their friendship across cultural and geographical distances. The 1970s brought new challenges and opportunities for both men as they entered the later phases of their careers, and began to think more systematically about the legacies they wanted to leave. Whitman, now in his 60s, and one of the most respected surgeons in the Midwest, began to focus more on teaching and mentoring young doctors, passing on not just technical skills, but also the ethical principles that had guided his own practice. His students at the University of Minnesota Medical School knew him as a demanding but caring instructor who emphasized the importance of seeing patients as complete human beings rather than collections of symptoms and injuries. Sakamoto, meanwhile, had become a senior figure in Japanese education, serving as a principal and eventually as a district administrator responsible for curriculum development and teacher training. His influence extended far beyond his immediate responsibilities, as he worked to incorporate international perspectives and cross-cultural understanding into Japanese educational policy. His efforts contributed to the development of exchange programs that brought American teachers and students to Japan while sending Japanese educators to the United States, creating networks of personal relationships that strengthened the alliance between the two nations. In 1975, 30 years after the end of World War II, Sakamoto and Whitman collaborated on a remarkable project that would serve as a lasting testament to the power of personal reconciliation to transcend historical grievances. Working with historians and educators in both countries, they developed a joint presentation about their wartime encounter and its aftermath, designed to be delivered to high school and college students as part of peace education curricula. The presentation, which they delivered together on several occasions during the late 70s and early 80s, provided young people with a concrete example of how enemies could become friends and how individual acts of compassion could have far-reaching consequences. The impact of these presentations was profound and lasting, inspiring countless students to think more deeply about the nature of conflict and reconciliation, the importance of questioning propaganda and stereotypes, and the possibilities for building bridges across cultural and political divisions. Many of the students who heard Sakamoto and Whitman speak together went on to careers in international relations, education, medicine, and business, carrying forward the lessons they had learned about the power of human connection to overcome historical animosity. As both men entered their retirement years during the 1980s, their friendship took on an additional dimension as they began to reflect more explicitly on the meaning and significance of their relationship within the broader context of 20th century history. They had witnessed and participated in one of the most remarkable transformations in international relations: the conversion of Japan and America from bitter enemies to close allies, and their personal story provided a microcosm of that larger historical development. Whitman, looking back on his career as a surgeon and educator, identified his treatment of Sakamoto as one of the most meaningful moments of his professional life, not because of the technical complexity of the surgery, but because of the human connections it had created and the broader implications it had demonstrated. In interviews with medical journals and historical researchers, he spoke about the importance of maintaining professional ethics and human compassion, even under the extreme pressures of wartime. And he credited his encounter with Sakamoto with reinforcing his commitment to treating all patients with equal care, regardless of their background or circumstances. Sakamoto's reflections on their relationship were equally profound, focusing on the ways in which Whitman's simple statement, "because you're human," had served as a catalyst for his own moral and intellectual development. In speeches and writings during his retirement, he often returned to that moment in the ship's medical bay as a turning point that had opened his eyes to possibilities he had never imagined during his military service. He described the encounter as a form of education that had been more powerful than any classroom instruction, teaching him lessons about dignity, compassion, and mutual respect that had shaped every aspect of his subsequent life. The legacy of their friendship extended beyond their personal relationship to influence the broader development of Japanese-American relations in the post-war era. Through their educational work, their public speaking, and their example as individuals who had transcended the hatreds of war to build a lasting friendship, Sakamoto and Whitman contributed to the cultural and emotional foundations of the alliance between their two nations. Their story became part of the narrative of reconciliation that helped transform former enemies into partners in promoting peace and prosperity in the Pacific region. In 1992, nearly 50 years after their first meeting, Sakamoto and Whitman were honored by both the Japanese and American governments for their contributions to international understanding and friendship. The ceremony, held at the Japanese Embassy in Washington, brought together diplomats, educators, and veterans from both countries to celebrate not just their individual achievements, but also the broader possibility of healing that their relationship represented. Both men, now in their 70s, spoke movingly about the journey that had brought them from a wartime medical bay to a celebration of peace and friendship. Whitman's death in 1995, at the age of 84, marked the end of an era for Sakamoto, who had lost not just a friend, but also a living connection to the transformative experience that had shaped his adult life. The funeral in Minnesota drew mourners from across the United States and several from Japan, including former students, medical colleagues, and individuals whose lives had been touched by Whitman's example of compassionate professionalism. Sakamoto, despite his advanced age and declining health, made the journey to America to deliver a eulogy that captured both the personal loss he felt and the broader significance of Whitman's life and work. In his eulogy, Sakamoto spoke about the moment when Whitman had chosen to see him as a human being rather than an enemy, and how that simple act of recognition had set in motion a chain of events that had influenced thousands of lives over the subsequent decades. He described Whitman as a teacher who had never stopped learning, a healer who had understood that medical care was just one aspect of the broader human obligation to reduce suffering and promote well-being, and a friend who had demonstrated the possibility of building bridges across the deepest cultural and historical divisions. Sakamoto himself lived until 2003, reaching the age of 84 and witnessing the dawn of a new century that brought both new challenges and new opportunities for international cooperation. In his final years, he worked on a memoir that told the complete story of his encounter with Whitman and its aftermath, providing future generations with a detailed account of how personal transformation could contribute to broader historical change. The memoir, published posthumously in both Japanese and English, became a widely read testament to the power of individual choice to transcend the limitations imposed by war, propaganda, and cultural prejudice. The story of Hiroshi Sakamoto and Charles Whitman serves as a reminder that even in the midst of humanity's darkest conflicts, individuals retain the capacity to choose compassion over hatred, understanding over prejudice, and healing over harm. Their relationship, which began with a medical procedure performed under the most unlikely circumstances, evolved into a friendship that lasted half a century and influenced thousands of lives in both Japan and America. It stands as proof that the bonds of common humanity are stronger than the divisions created by politics, nationalism, or military conflict, and that single acts of kindness can have consequences that echo across generations. Their legacy continues to inspire new generations of students, educators, medical professionals, and international relations specialists who study their example as a model for building bridges across cultural and political differences. In an era when global tensions and cultural misunderstandings continue to threaten peace and cooperation, the story of the Japanese petty officer and the American Navy surgeon offers hope that individual choices to see beyond stereotypes and respond to human need can create foundations for lasting reconciliation, and friendship. The simple phrase, "because you're human," spoken in a ship's medical bay during World War II, became the seed from which grew a remarkable friendship and a powerful example of how enemies can become allies, how prejudice can be overcome through personal encounter, and how the healing arts can serve not just individual patients, but also the broader cause of international understanding and peace. The ripple effects of that moment continued to expand long after both men had passed away, influencing institutions, policies, and countless individual lives in ways that neither Sakamoto nor Whitman could have imagined during their wartime encounter. The memoir that Sakamoto had completed before his death became required reading in many Japanese schools, where it was used to teach students about the complexities of war, the dangers of propaganda, and the importance of maintaining one's humanity even under the most extreme circumstances. Teachers across Japan found that the story provided an accessible way to discuss difficult historical topics while emphasizing positive lessons about reconciliation and personal growth. In the United States, Whitman's approach to treating enemy prisoners became a case study in military medical ethics courses, taught at naval academies and medical schools as an example of how professional obligations could transcend political considerations. The documentation of his surgical treatment of Sakamoto, preserved in naval medical records, was studied by historians and ethicists who sought to understand how individual choices during wartime could contribute to broader patterns of reconciliation and peace-building. Military doctors studying Whitman's case learned not just about surgical techniques, but about the moral courage required to maintain medical principles under pressure from colleagues and superiors who questioned the wisdom of treating enemy combatants. The medical bay where Whitman had first treated Sakamoto became an unexpected pilgrimage site for scholars and peace activists studying the personal dimensions of international reconciliation. The ship itself had been decommissioned and scrapped decades earlier, but photographs and detailed descriptions of the medical facilities were preserved in naval archives, providing researchers with insights into the physical environment where this remarkable encounter had taken place. Maritime museums in both countries developed exhibits about the incident, using replica medical equipment and authentic wartime artifacts to help visitors understand the context and significance of Whitman's decision to treat an enemy soldier with full professional care. The educational programs that Sakamoto and Whitman had developed during their later years evolved into permanent institutions dedicated to promoting cross-cultural understanding and conflict resolution. The Sakamoto-Whitman Institute for International Understanding, established jointly by universities in Minnesota and Tokyo, became a leading center for research and education about the role of personal relationships in diplomatic and cultural exchange. The Institute's fellowship programs brought together students, scholars, and practitioners from around the world to study successful examples of reconciliation and to develop new approaches to building bridges across cultural, and political divides. One of the Institute's most successful programs was a medical exchange that sent American doctors to work in Japanese hospitals, while bringing Japanese physicians to practice in American medical centers. The program, inspired directly by Whitman's example of compassionate medical care, emphasized not just the sharing of technical knowledge, but also the importance of cultural sensitivity and human connection in healing relationships. Participants in the program often reported that their experiences had transformed their understanding of both medicine and international relations, giving them first-hand insight into how professional cooperation could transcend national boundaries and historical grievances. The Institute also sponsored an annual conference that brought together individuals who had experienced personal transformation through cross-cultural encounters, creating a forum for sharing stories and strategies that could be applied to contemporary conflicts around the world. These conferences became renowned for their combination of scholarly analysis and personal testimony, offering participants both intellectual frameworks for understanding reconciliation and emotional inspiration drawn from real-life examples of enemies becoming friends. Research conducted at the Institute revealed that the Sakamoto-Whitman story was part of a larger pattern of personal reconciliation that had occurred throughout the Pacific War and its aftermath. Though few other cases had been as well documented or had generated such lasting institutional consequences, scholars identified hundreds of similar instances where American medical personnel had treated Japanese prisoners with exceptional care, and where Japanese individuals had responded with gratitude and transformed understanding that influenced their post-war attitudes toward America and Americans. The Institute's researchers also documented the broader impact of these individual reconciliation stories on the development of Japanese-American relations in the post-war era. They found that personal relationships formed during the war and occupation period had created networks of trust and understanding that facilitated diplomatic cooperation, economic partnership, and cultural exchange throughout the Cold War period and beyond. The study revealed that while official diplomacy had been important in rebuilding the relationship between the two nations, The foundation for that diplomacy had been laid by thousands of individual encounters that had demonstrated the possibility of mutual respect and friendship. Among the most significant discoveries made by Institute researchers was the extent to which Sakamoto's educational work had influenced Japanese attitudes toward international cooperation and conflict resolution. Interviews with his former students revealed that his teaching had not just conveyed information about American culture and English language, but had fundamentally shaped their understanding of how different nations and peoples could work together to address common challenges. Many of these students had gone on to careers in diplomacy, international business, and academic research, carrying forward the lessons of tolerance and mutual respect that they had learned from their teacher. The Institute's Oral History Project collected hundreds of interviews with individuals whose lives had been touched by the Sakamoto-Whitman story, either through direct contact with the two men or through exposure to their educational programs and public presentations. These interviews revealed the remarkable extent to which a single act of medical compassion had generated expanding circles of influence that continued to affect new generations of people decades after the Burr. Original encounter. Former students spoke about how Sakamoto's example had inspired them to pursue careers in international relations or cross-cultural education, while medical professionals described how Whitman's approach to patient care had influenced their own treatment of patients from different cultural backgrounds. One particularly moving interview was conducted with Maria Rodriguez, the daughter of Seaman Rodriguez, who had initially questioned Whitman's decision to treat the Japanese prisoner. Maria had grown up hearing her father's stories about the war, including his gradual change of heart about treating enemy wounded after observing Whitman's dedicated care for Sakamoto. Her father had eventually become one of Whitman's most trusted assistants in treating wounded prisoners, and his transformation from hostility to compassion had shaped Maria's own career as a nurse specializing in BRET, refugee and immigrant healthcare. My father used to say that watching Dr. Whitman work on that Japanese sailor taught him more about being an American than all the patriotic speeches he had ever heard, Maria recalled during her interview. He said that real patriotism wasn't about hating your enemies, but about living up to the values that made your country worth defending. That lesson stayed with him for the rest of his life, and he passed it on to all of us kids. I think that's why I ended up working with refugees, because I learned from my dad that taking care of people who need help is what Americans are supposed to do. The Institute's research also uncovered evidence of the story's influence on contemporary conflict resolution efforts around the world. Peace negotiators and reconciliation specialists had begun using the Sakamoto-Whitman example as a model for how personal relationships could be built across seemingly insurmountable cultural and political divides. Their story had been cited in peace agreements, referenced in Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports, and used as a training tool for diplomats and humanitarian workers operating in conflict zones. Dr. Jennifer Chen, a conflict resolution specialist who had studied at the Institute, used the story in her work, mediating ethnic conflicts in Southeast Asia during the early 2000s. What made the Sakamoto-Whitman example so powerful, she explained in a conference presentation, was not just that an American doctor treated a Japanese prisoner well, but that both men were willing to let that encounter change their fundamental understanding of who they were and what they stood for. That kind of personal transformation is essential for real reconciliation, and their story provides a roadmap for how it can happen. The story's influence extended into popular culture as well, inspiring novels, films, and documentary projects that brought the message of reconciliation to even broader audiences. A Japanese filmmaker created an award-winning documentary about Sakamoto's life and his friendship with Officer Whitman, featuring interviews with surviving family members, former students, and colleagues who had witnessed the lasting impact of their wartime encounter. The film, which premiered simultaneously in Tokyo and Minneapolis, was credited with introducing a new generation of viewers to the possibilities for healing and friendship that could emerge from even, quote, the most bitter conflicts. An American novelist wrote a best-selling historical fiction work based loosely on the Sakamoto-Whitman story, using their example as the foundation for a broader exploration of how individual choices during wartime could have far-reaching consequences for both personal destiny and historical development. The novel, which spent months on bestseller lists in both countries, sparked widespread discussion about the role of compassion and moral courage in overcoming cultural prejudice and international hostility. The continued relevance of the Sakamoto-Whitman story was demonstrated most clearly during the early 21st century, when rising tensions between various nations and cultural groups created new challenges for international understanding and cooperation. Educational institutions around the world began incorporating their example into curricula designed to teach students about the importance of seeing beyond stereotypes and propaganda, to recognize the common humanity that connects all people regardless of nationality, religion, or cultural background. High school students in diverse communities found particular inspiration in the story's message that young people could choose to reject the hatreds and prejudices they had been taught, and instead embrace more inclusive and compassionate worldviews. Student exchange programs began using the Sakamoto-Whitman example as an orientation tool, helping participants understand how their own cross-cultural experiences could contribute to broader patterns of international understanding and reconciliation. The medical community's ongoing engagement with the story reflected its continued relevance for healthcare professionals working in increasingly diverse and complex environments. Medical schools incorporated case studies based on Whitman's treatment of Sakamoto into their ethics curricula, using the historical example to help students think about how cultural competence and human compassion could enhance their effectiveness as healers. Nursing programs used the story to illustrate the importance of seeing patients as complete human beings rather than collections of symptoms, and to demonstrate how small acts of kindness could have profound therapeutic effects. International medical relief organizations found the story particularly relevant for training volunteers and staff members who would be working in conflict zones or with refugee populations. The example of Whitman's dedicated care for an enemy combatant provided a powerful illustration of how medical professionals could maintain their ethical commitments even under the most challenging circumstances, and how their actions could contribute to broader efforts at peace-building and reconciliation. The story's influence on military medical training was equally significant, with armed forces around the world using Whitman's example to teach medics and military physicians about the importance of treating all wounded individuals with, equal care regardless of their uniform or nationality. Military medical officers studying the case learned not just about the technical aspects of trauma surgery, but about the moral courage required to maintain professional standards under pressure from colleagues who might question the wisdom of expending resources on enemy casualties. The psychological dimensions of the Sakamoto-Whitman story attracted increasing attention from researchers studying the processes by which individuals overcame deeply ingrained prejudices and, transformed their fundamental worldviews. Psychologists and social scientists found that their example provided valuable insights into the conditions that could facilitate personal change and growth, even when that change required abandoning beliefs and attitudes that had been central to one's identity and social relationships. Studies of prejudice reduction and attitude change frequently referenced the moment when Whitman had told Sakamoto, "Because you're human," identifying it as a perfect example of how simple statements of recognition and inclusion could serve as catalysts for profound personal transformation. Researchers noted that the effectiveness of Whitman's words had depended not just on their content, but on the context in which they were delivered, the authenticity of the speaker's actions, and the recipient's readiness to receive and internalize a new understanding of himself and his relationship to others. The story's relevance for contemporary discussions about immigration, multiculturalism, and social integration was recognized by policymakers and community leaders who sought to build more inclusive and harmonious societies. Community organizations used the Sakamoto-Whitman example in workshops and training programs designed to help residents of diverse neighborhoods understand how personal relationships could bridge cultural differences and create foundations for mutual respect and cooperation. Religious and spiritual communities found particular meaning in the story's themes of redemption, forgiveness, and the recognition of universal human dignity. Interfaith organizations use the example to illustrate how individuals from different cultural and religious backgrounds could find common ground through shared experiences of compassion and mutual care. The story became part of sermons, meditation sessions, and religious education programs that emphasized the importance of seeing the divine spark, or Buddha nature, in all people, regardless of their external circumstances or apparent differences. The educational legacy of Sakamoto's teaching career continued to influence pedagogical approaches to international education and cross-cultural understanding. Teachers around the world adopted his methods of using personal stories and direct cultural exchange to help students develop more sophisticated and nuanced understanding of other societies and peoples. His emphasis on questioning propaganda and thinking critically about the sources and motivations behind different cultural narratives became a cornerstone of media literacy and critical thinking curricula in schools struggling to help students navigate increasingly complex information environments. The annual memorial services held in both Minnesota and Tokyo to honor Sakamoto and Whitman became gatherings that brought together individuals from many different countries and backgrounds who had been inspired by their example. These ceremonies, which featured speakers from various fields including medicine, education, diplomacy, and peace-building, served as reminders of the continuing relevance of their story and the ongoing need for individuals willing to choose compassion over hatred, understanding over prejudice, and healing over harm. The memorial services also provided opportunities for new generations to learn about the historical context that had made Sakamoto and Whitman's friendship so remarkable, helping younger participants understand how their encounter had taken place against a background of intense propaganda, racial prejudice, and military indoctrination that had taught both men to view each other as subhuman enemies, deserving only destruction. The contrast between those taught hatreds and the friendship that actually developed provided powerful lessons about the malleability of human attitudes and the possibility for positive change even under the most unlikely circumstances. As the 21st century progressed and the world faced new challenges related to terrorism, cultural conflict, and international tension, the Sakamoto-Whitman story continued to offer hope and guidance for those seeking to build bridges across seemingly insurmountable divides. Their example demonstrated that even the most bitter enemies could become friends when they encountered each other as human beings, rather than as abstract representatives of hostile ideologies or threatening foreign powers. The story's message remained particularly relevant for healthcare professionals working in conflict zones, refugee camps, and other settings where they encountered individuals who might be viewed as enemies or threats by their own governments or communities. Medical personnel trained in the Sakamoto-Whitman tradition learned to see their professional obligations as transcending political considerations, understanding that their commitment to healing and human welfare could contribute to broader efforts at peace-building and reconciliation. In the end, Sakamoto and Whitman proved that the most profound transformations often begin with the smallest acts of recognition, the simple acknowledgement of shared humanity that transcends all artificial boundaries and opens possibilities for connection that can change the world. Their legacy continues to inspire new generations of individuals who choose to see beyond the surface differences that divide people and instead focus on the common needs, hopes, and vulnerabilities that unite all members of the human family. Through their example, they demonstrated that every person has the power to choose compassion over hatred, understanding over prejudice, and healing over harm, and that these individual choices, multiplied across countless encounters and relationships, can ultimately transform the world in which we all live.